This is the Cool I See, and I want to offer some thoughts about racism. I would like to take about 5 or 10 minutes just to offer a few thoughts about racism. First of all, racism, like anything else, can be seen as a positive. It can be a positive idea if looked at in the right purposes. Why are there different races? What are the different races? Who are the people in these different races? Where are the people in these races? And how are these races races? How did they become races? Who, what, when, where, why, and how? If you want to get to understanding the matter, that's all that it is. In God we trust. Now, what are races? Races are, for lack of better words, races are people that are things in places. Races are people that are things in places. Not people, places, and things, but people that are things that have been placed somewhere. And where they have been placed is how their race seemed to have come to be. If they were placed somewhere else, they would have seemed to be another race. But how they became their race is where they were placed and when they were placed. And that's the who, what, when, where, why, and how. That's who they are. Where they was placed, when they was placed, which is how they became to be who they are. Now, if looked at it for that reason, then you can still use the scientific theory of adaptation, that races came to be by adapting to the environment around them through the process that's still called evolution. You can still use that scientific jargon if you like, and it still seems to have some sense of validity, and there are facts to corroborate that those ideas. Now, when did racism come into play between races? Racism came into play when races began to mix and mingle. Before races were mixing and mingling, there was no sense of racism how it is typically understood today. So, in other words, when the Bible told Israel to stay with your own race, do not become like the foreigners of the races that the Lord God was going to send them in the different lands flowing with milk and honey. Therefore, racism was still positive in the Bible. It was still a positive concept. Stay with your own people. Be amongst your own people, but you're going to mingle because the other people need to know God. They need to know God. They did not know God like that, and they needed to know God. But sticking with not being religious, racism, by way of adaptation via evolution, racism can be a positive trait. Now, when the races begin to mingle and to assimilate and to integrate amongst one another, then something began to happen that something began to happen, and that thing that began to happen was called comparisons began to be made. Comparisons. And racism came after comparisons were made and after races began to have contact with other races. There was one thing that happened. Comparisons were made. And if you look at the word comparisons, you can almost spell the word racism from the word comparisons. You can just take the letters that are in the word comparisons, and the word racism is literally right there. Racism comes from comparisons. Love being the highest ideal, love being the highest attribute and the power of the universe, love makes no comparisons whatsoever. Love makes no comparisons. For example, the Bible tells you in 6 days the Lord God created the heavens and the earth. Everything that the Lord God created, one thing was said to be, and the Lord God looked and saw that it was all good. It was good. It was all good. It was good. So racism, which came from the creation story, because that's where races came from, and mankind and humanity evolved from mankind. Racism only came from comparisons. Love makes no comparisons. So how do you deal with racism and keep it positive? By way of comparisons. You can use comparisons. The comparisons is compare what's similar, not what's different. What is exactly the same. And when you look at racism from similarities and not differences, and don't perceive no differences whatsoever, then racism is still positive according to the laws of love, though. So that's one thing that the world needs to understand on the Kulai Sea, that racism comes from comparisons, and comparisons are evil. Comparisons come from basically the devil seeing how weak it was compared to God. And then all other comparisons are in between that, because the devil died and God lives forever, created life. So therefore, racism can be a positive if comparisons are to see what's similar and not what's different. Now, very quickly, because I don't want to take a whole bunch of time, nothing that is true is complicated and takes hours and hours to explain for sure. So, very quickly, how do you deal with a racist? It's very simply, you just ignore it.